If we stand up to it, we look good. I think understanding that as at least one of the roots of Russia and the anti-U.S. feeling is very important. And the secrecy, the United States is very transparent because the United States is very strong and very confident. The more strong and confident you are, the more transparent you can afford to be because your transparency scares everybody else. The more nervous you are and the more you worry that the other guy actually is stronger than you are, the less transparent you want to be. And that has nothing to do with your political system or how free your newspapers are. So.
Nadia McConnell.
I don't know if any rational person is against an arms control agreement. So the question is not, should there be one, and is it in the best interest of both the United States and Russia? I think the question is, at what cost? And what is it that we have to give in order to reach this agreement? I'm a little maybe puzzled by the discussion about a possible attack in Georgia. I mean, the Russians are in Georgia. It's my understanding that they have not abided by the ceasefire agreement. When we look at other situations, what's happening in Transnistria, Crimea, it's been said, and actually we had a presentation last week, where it was reported that in meetings in Moscow with not policymakers, but analysts, there was this position that in order for Russia to give the United States support for Iran and North Korea, the big deal is that we have to recognize their right in this for a sphere of influence in the region. So how do we deal with moving forward on the arms agreement, but not, and also deal with these other issues?
Well, there used to be a time when these kinds of issues would be linked together, the famous linkage theory of Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. But that's not the case now. These issues are going to be negotiated independently of each other. There was no progress that I could discern at the summit in regard to Russia's claims of a sphere of influence in the CIS and its demand for a new European security architecture. There was progress on strategic arms, and those issues are not going to be dealt with in a linked fashion. So there is going to continue to be a lot of rivalry and tension here, because for Russia, the test of its ability to be a great power is its ability to have an exclusive sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union. And for the United States and for its allies and for the states that emerged out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, their independence is the foundation of the current security system. And it's not going to be possible for us to look the other way on that. And Vice President Biden and President Obama have both said that we're not going to recognize Georgia, and Biden's going to Georgia and Ukraine any day now in order to show American support. The European Union is ending with Russia for the Ukraine. So these issues are going to remain in play, even as there's progress towards the strategic arms limitation agreement.
Failing to negotiate an arms control agreement with Russia is not going to get Russian troops out of South Ossetia. I mean, I think that's the bottom line of it, that you're not giving anything up because there's nothing you would gain by failing to negotiate this agreement in this context. Moreover, putting it in those terms, basically it puts the United States in the position of saying we are protecting Russia's neighbors again from Russia. And that's not a position the United States wants to be in. As I said, in regards to Ukraine, and I think applies to all the countries on Russia's borders, Russia is one of the most important security relationships for all of these countries, and it's not going to stop being that. What the challenge is for U.S. policy as a friend to those countries, as an ally to states in Europe, is how do you promote relations with these states in a way that supports stability, in a way that doesn't play into zero-sum views, in a way that encourages cooperation with Russia while ensuring everybody's sovereignty is respected. And that is a challenge. But I think that's the important thing. I think that is figuring out how to do that well and developing relationships with these countries that advance these goals can be a tremendous success of U.S. foreign policy if it's done right.
When President Obama was elected in November, he woke up the next morning and found that President Medvedev had threatened to deploy nuclear-capable Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad, an enclave between Lithuania and Poland, still controlled by Russia. This came as a bit of a rude shock and a surprise, actually, in the West, that President Medvedev would say something like this when, in fact, a Democrat was elected president who was known to be more skeptical of missile defense than President Bush. In the summit in Moscow, President Medvedev seemed to play down the threat of missile defense in Poland and missile defense missiles there, which would be few in number and couldn't really pose a threat to the Russian forces, in part because of physics and the curvature of the Earth. Then, 2 days later, at the G8 summit in Italy, President Medvedev again, in front of international leaders, threatened to deploy Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad. Are the Russian leaders just trying to be nice to President Obama when he's in Moscow, and their real policy is what President Medvedev stated both before and after the summit? Or is there a policy debate in Moscow, do you think, between harder line forces and softer line forces, and the varying views that are expressed may reflect an internal debate?
Well, there's definitely a debate in Moscow, and the opposing statements, or even contradictory statements, if you like, by Medvedev reflect this. Immediately after the summit, there was an outburst of media criticism of Medvedev that Russia did not get enough in strategic arms. It gave up too much. That particularly it did not get the linkage it wanted between offense and defense. So you have Russian versions of the Crownhammer critique on their side as well. And we have open evidence of an open split between Mr. Putin's orientation, which is very anti-American, and the forces around him, which are the energy barons, the military intelligence people, the so-called Siloviki, and Mr. Medvedev's entourage, which is not necessarily pro-Western, but more interested in trying to figure out how to reform the Russian system because their economy is in much worse shape even than ours, given the crisis. So the attacks on Medvedev for having given away the store began the minute Obama got on his plane and left for the G8. And he felt constrained to reiterate that his threat still stood on the table. And this is an important point, because if the forces that have the upper hand in the Russian debate believe that missile defense has not been sufficiently addressed from their point of view, they will refuse to reduce offensive weapons, and there will be no treaty. And that has to be understood. They are trying to hold the treaty hostage to the fictitious threat assessment that they have of the supposed threat from these missile defenses, which cannot physically threaten Russian nuclear weapons or missiles in any shape or form. But they are determined to force those missiles out, and they're going to try to hold any offensive reductions hostage to missile defenses, because that's, after all, what they believe in, this linkage. And it stems from their fundamental viewpoint that the United States is an adversarial power, and that the relationship is fundamentally an adversarial one. So this has to be taken into account.
I'm wary of talking about Putin and Medvedev factions in the Russian government. I think there are certainly disagreements on any number of policy issues between any number of people within the Russian decision-making structures, and I think they break down on along different lines and different issues. And it's a fairly insular decision-making process. So we make a lot of guesses, but we can't really be certain of what happens. any more than the Russians really understand what goes on in our cabinet meetings and our National Security Council staffs. Nor should they. I mean, that's just not how decisions are made. I would also say, though, that there's very little